I'm Tyler Bug, Associate Director of New America NYC. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. When we initially started promoting this event, we were titling it Democracy Restored, which, given the circumstances of the last 24 hours, maybe seems a little less relevant than it was when we woke up this morning. But actually, to talk about restoring democracy is to also acknowledge that there's a problem that needs to be fixed. And so actually, I think that framing could be very generative for the conversation that we're going to have tonight. I'll just very briefly say that the original inspiration for tonight's event was a new book that's been published by New America fellow Sabeel Rahman. Thank you, Dan. The book is Democracy Against Domination. It's an incredible read on the state of democracy, the crisis on inequality, and the future of progressive politics. So we hope you'll stick around after the conversation, have an extra glass of wine, and Sabeel will stick around and be signing copies of the book right outside. By way of very brief introduction, moderating tonight's conversation is Daniel Altschuler. Daniel is the managing director of Make the Road Action, which is a grassroots organization working with working class and Latino communities to push for justice-oriented policy innovation. And I'll let him introduce the rest of our speakers. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that for many of us here in the room, this has been a day and an evening of mourning, frankly. I work with an immigrant rights organization, and we've spent the last 24 hours really processing this for folks. And you know, as hard as it's been for me as a privileged white guy, I can tell you that speaking with folks who of various immigration statuses, folks who've been the butt of a tremendous amount of anti-immigrant vitriol, among other types of vitriol in the last 18 months, this is a tremendously scary and difficult time. So I just wanted to note that. We want to have a couple of opening remarks and a conversation here among the panelists, and then we do want to get to also how folks are feeling in the room and questions from you related to what this moment is, what some key ideas that Sabeel is raising in his work, not just in this book, but in other fora as well, and how they may guide us as we move forward. So with that, just a brief introduction of our esteemed and amazing panelists. Sabeel Rahman is the Assistant Professor of Law at Brooklyn Law School. He is a Fellow at New America and the Roosevelt Institute, and he is the author, again, of this really excellent read, Democracy Against Domination, which I highly recommend. Dorian Warren is a contributor at MSNBC, a Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, and the Board Chair of the Center for Community Change. And we're excited also to have Keisha Gaskins-Nathan, who's the Director of the Democratic Practice Program at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and former Senior Counsel on my paper at the Brennan Center for Justice. So we thought we could open up with you, Sabeel. And you know, many of us are trying to make sense of what happened last night. It's a pretty challenging and historic moment for many of us for all the wrong reasons. And but asking some questions about the values of democracy, equality, inclusion. These are things that come up in your book and in the work that you've put forth. And I'm wondering how you're thinking about the current moment and the prospects for the next 4 years.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks a lot, Daniel, and thanks, Keisha and Dorian, for being here, and Tyler and Margaret at Civic Hall for putting this on, and all of you for coming out. You know, I do think that we're all sort of in the process of making sense in real time of how our political reality has changed so dramatically in the last 24 hours. But I wanted maybe to add to the discussion, or start the discussion, take a step back historically and zoom out a little bit. So this isn't the first time where we face this particular kind of convergence of economic upheaval, deep, pervasive sense of inequality, rampant private power, worries about the economy and the nature of opportunity on the one hand, and a deep distrust or disaffection towards our political institutions as being corrupt, ineffectual, not up to the task of addressing our concerns. If you think 100 years ago, in the face of the Industrial Revolution, similar kinds of upheaval and concern gave rise to a moment of flux that produced a bunch of different kinds of political movements, including populist movement, progressive movement. This is the early days where the labor movement was really gaining strength. And so I mentioned that to say that there are, right as my first point, there are moments where things really feel up for grabs. And I think we're living in one of those moments. And those moments don't come about very often. And I think the debates we're having now will really set the foundations of what our economy, what our democracy, what our society looks like for many decades to come. So how should we think about all of this? Well, one of the things, main arguments I try to make in the book is that there is a tradition of what I think of as progressive populism. And the content of that is really the title of the book in a nutshell, Democracy Against Domination. I think at its heart, progressive populism of the kind we saw in figures like Louis Brandeis, who's a lawyer, Supreme Court justice, movement leader in the early 20th century. I think for people then, the focus was two things. First, this idea of domination, that the problem of the modern economy isn't really just about growth, and it's not about efficiency, it's about the distribution of power. And the distribution of power over the economy shapes the scope of economic freedom. It shapes what each of us are able to achieve, what opportunities we have, and sort of what our economic lifeblood is. And the way we counteract the form of power is through democracy, through collective action, through the idea of popular sovereignty, right? That we collectively can make our own economic and political futures. And I think a lot of what we're seeing on left and right is, in a sense, a response to this idea that we don't have control. We don't have control over these economic forces. We don't have control over our own government. And so that's deeply, that's a sort of deep anxiety. So I talk about this tradition of progressivism in the book, and the last thing I'll say, sort of as a kind of opening remarks anyway, is I think it contrasts sharply with a lot of how mainstream liberalism has evolved over the last few decades, and I want to call that out a little bit. So I think mainstream liberalism, say over the last maybe 30-odd years, has not really focused on this idea of power or this idea of democracy. I'd say it's actually really been focused on a much thinner notion of what government is for and what a good economy looks like. The focus is more on closing market failures, optimizing a market society with occasional judicious sort of top-down technocratic regulation. And so think about the financial crisis. So this is a moment which was in many ways presaged some of the debates we're having now, 8 years ago. And the mainstream response to this was, from a very progressive administration in the Obama administration, was basically, let's give more power to the Fed and have smart people at the Fed solve our problems for us. Problem with that is that it doesn't really speak to these underlying concerns of economic power or this deeper question of democracy. And one last thing that I should say, and then I want to pass it on. Part of, I think, what we're seeing with Trump and with this sort of kind of terrifying resurgence of what I think of as an exclusionary populism, a populism that talks about the economy, talks about popular sovereignty, but framed in a way that it's only for a specific subset of the people. The people who count in this mode of populism is mainly white men, and not anybody else. That is, in some ways, a response to these same concerns about power, about democratic disaffection. And I think the task for progressives is to figure out, what is a progressive populism that is up to the challenge of the moment, that can respond to, displace, counteract the reactionary, exclusionary populism that we see sort of so ascendant today.
I want to turn it over to you, Dorian. Thoughts about where we are and this idea of a progressive populism.
So, thank you. Hey, everybody. I couldn't imagine actually a better place to be on this day than here in our group therapy session. It's been an emotional roller coaster for me because as you see, I put my Cubs hat there on the table. I'm a Chicagoan and I wear it on my sleeve, and so I went from 1 week winning the World Series to today. Right? So it's been an emotional roller coaster. I want to thank Sabeel in particular on a day like this for the work. You know, the thing about books is you don't see all the years of work that went into them when you start reading the words on the page. And I imagine that what was once a dissertation and is now an amazing book manuscript, not book, published book, took over 10 years of thinking and rigorous work, intellectual work. So I want to first thank Sabeel for the long haul to produce this book
It is
that
a
we
long
shall
haul.
read. And just to acknowledge that. And especially on a day like today, the book is actually, there's so much to say about it, so I just want to say a word about the book. It's visionary in a sense. It takes us to, it grounds itself in normative political theory, asking questions about what is democracy, what is freedom and unfreedom, which is domination, right? Domination is essentially unfreedom. And then what is justice, and what does a progressive vision look like for the 21st century? It gives you some history of late 19th and early 20th century progressivism, and then it then gives us a vision for what a 21st century progressivism can really look like in the thickest ways. And so I just want to also acknowledge, and especially on this point of inclusionary populism, so that we don't repeat the mistakes of exclusionary populism from the late 19th, early 20th century. So it's a very visionary document. For those of you that haven't bought the book, I hope that whets your appetite a little bit. On Daniel's comments, I work with a group called the Center for Community Change and Life Can Make the Road. We've been heavily involved in the immigration fight the last decade, so it's a particularly hard day for us that work with immigrant families and communities, and especially thinking about children who are asking lots of questions today of what yesterday's results mean for them and their families. And we're, frankly, we had to sober up really quickly and strategize, I know you did, Daniel, about what is our defense strategy, whether it's deportations, martial law, whatever is on its way. How do we protect the harm that is surely coming to too many vulnerable populations in this country? So it's been a hard day to mourn, but we also have to mourn and then resist and then organize. And I also say this as a Black American, and talking to my mother as a Black woman in this country and how she feels. So I know we all are going to get into this. The one reflection I'd have about the election is that, and Sabeel hinted at this, how does the saying go, history doesn't repeat, but it sometimes rhymes?
Yeah.
So we've actually seen this before, and Sabeel mentioned this, and I've been grappling with metaphors or historical examples all day. The one that comes to mind, someone said to me last night, this is the end of the Obama era, is sort of like the end of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow. And so it made me think of what was the response to Reconstruction, right? It was Southern redemption. Southern redemption. And Southern redemption, there was the Compromise of 1877 involving this thing called the Electoral College, right? That was created to protect the institution of slavery. And as we now know, Secretary Clinton won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. So if there's any doubt about the historical legacy of the founding racial and economic institution of slavery on our lives today, it is that. It is that. So I was thinking about Southern redemption. Van Jones last night on CNN in this very emotional moment that has gone viral called it white lash. I kind of think of it as this is sort of 21st century redemption of the gains we made in the civil rights movement, the women's movement, feminist movement, and then of course marriage equality, LGBTQ rights. I think this is all a backlash to all of that, this form of redemption we're living through. So I pulled this quote from Du Bois in his magisterial Black Reconstruction in America from 1935, and he writes about Reconstruction. The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery, and it just feels like that today. And especially, thinking about that text, it reminded me that the concern of especially Southern whites was what the impact of the 4 million votes of free blacks would be. And I think we are seeing that history rhyming today because there is literal white anxiety about the new potential votes of non-white people, people of color. And I think, and again, we're going to hear a lot of analysis about this, but I think Trump actually provides what Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness. He is that symbol for many Americans who, through the, frankly, domination in Sabil's terms, in terms of lack of power, of corporate monopolies and monopsonies, just economic power, to be frank about it, the lack of political power, the lack of democracy. There are real objective conditions and suffering from domination that people are feeling, and it's being played out in a racially anxious way. And by the way, we're not the only ones. This is all Western democracies, right? So I don't want to be an American exceptionalist either in this moment. The last thing I'll say, Sabil's vision of what I'll call progressivism for the 21st century mostly focuses on the national level and thinking about how to regulate private power, economic power, the banks, what went wrong with our reforms, Dodd-Frank from 2009, 2010. I think in this moment it's important to lift up actually the victories we did have yesterday, because we did have some. But it's not a coincidence that it's at the state and local level. And so this might be a period we think about as a period of progressive federalism, where we really push hard on experimentation in our laboratories of democracy in the states and cities around minimum wage, paid sick, which minimum wage won every place yesterday. What are some of the reforms that Sabil talks about? I hope you say more about them. I think we can, this is still a moment to, in our blue islands, like New York City, that we can experiment radically in this moment while protecting vulnerable communities. And think about a vision that Sabil provides us in 2018 and 2020 and 2022, where we can scale up some local and state victories. But now I think will be a period of, much like the early progressives, right, the first progressives, who were experimenting at the state and local level at a moment of Jim Crow, at a moment of the Gilded Age, 100 years plus ago, before it was scaled up in the New Deal. So I think we're in that moment, and I'll stop here because I've gone too long. I think we're in that moment, and I am actually thankful, Sabil, that you have this vision, this analysis and this vision for us to look forward, to keep our eyes focused, because I would not want us to get stuck in our mourning in this moment.
Thank you. Thank you for that progressive reflection, very helpful reflection. Keisha, do you want to share your thoughts?
Sure, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Okay, we're going to try this one. I realize we're all in mourning, but that does not excuse this kind of response. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
All right, thank you so much. And I want to thank you, thanks Sabil for inviting me to share some of my comments and thoughts. And the other thing I really want to thank Sabil for in light of Dorian's comments, this book was a lot of work. And Sabil's willingness to open up the conversation, to reach sort of beyond the pages of his book, and to talk about where we are now, I think reflects the values that he approached the book with and the generosity of spirit through which we're sort of approaching this conversation. And you all have given me a couple sort of jumping off places. And one of the challenges I think we have to be very cautious about is I don't believe yet know who is that coalition, who is that 47.5% of the popular vote that made up Trump's support. There is no question that we have a reactionary response, that this doesn't feel like the kind of democracy we want. But one of the challenges that we work with and work through as we look at sort of the ideas of democratic reform is the idea of saying we don't get to pick outcomes. right? If there's a populist movement, if there's something that speaks to people, we don't get to say that's not democracy. We get to say we lost, we get to say this is not what we want to see, this is not the country we want to have, that it reflects values around equity, inclusion, economic inequality, that there are meaningful questions that we say this is not the kind of country we want to live in. But we have to be cautious to say this isn't democracy, right? And so what does that mean when we talk about these moments in time? What does it mean when we figure out who these folks are? And some of the exit polling has been a little bit antithetical to kind of what we thought we would have seen, right? So despite the conduct and language of the candidate at the top of the ticket, we still saw 47% of women voting for him who cast a ballot. Right? We simply saw more Latinos and more African Americans who voted for Romney voted for Trump. So this is not a sort of straight up, this is exclusionary, this is inclusionary. Now, also don't get me wrong, when we talk about white supremacy, the insidiousness of internalized racism is no joke. Right, so to suggest that the ability to compartmentalize and segregate who I am from who you are, and we're a different kind of Black person, or we're a different kind of Latino, so this message speaks to me in a different kind of way because I know they're not talking about me. That kind of dialogue, internal dialogue, I think is very much a part of that conversation, but I think the reality of the situation is that this isn't something that is simply divided sharply along lines that simply says, oh, this speaks to this kind of person, but not that kind of person. This is the right kind of democracy, not the wrong kind of democracy. So so some of the questions are, what are the systems and inclusionary processes that allow us to engage most effectively for the greatest good, for the greatest people? Right? Going back to the point that we have a winner of the popular vote for the 5th time that has lost the Electoral College. And 5 out of 45 isn't actually a lot, but it is enough to be disquieting, and it is enough to us to question and challenge how we're thinking about the systems and how we're thinking about the processes as we step into these spaces. One of the things, Dorian, that when you mentioned the sort of the rhythms or the rhymes with Reconstruction and Jim Crow, we have to recall that when Obama was elected in 2008, in 2010, there were over 180 restrictive laws around elections enacted between 2010 and 2011, right? As compared to the entire Jim Crow period, which was about 50 to 55, right? And so there was a strong, a harsh, an immediate response to the election of Barack Obama, and it was systemic and it was broad. And so when we look at outcomes like, say, in the state of South Carolina, where I think Clinton secured something like 35 or 37% of the vote at the end of the day. When I think about a state which was one of a handful of states that actually had a majority Black legislature following Reconstruction, yet today only mobilized 35% of the vote for the Democratic candidate. I'm like, there's something happening here, right? There's something structural going on here, and as we think about how we engage around these structural questions of our democracy, we also have to think about what that engagement looks like for who we are and how we fit today. One of the things I keep wanting to include in my bios, but I never do, which is I'm an organizer by birth and an attorney by training. That, my dad dragged me to these community meetings before I knew how to talk. I was, playing with the blocks while they were figuring out how to change the community, right? And so always being in these spaces and trying to figure this out. And one of the things that we think about at the RBF, and one of the things that we're really trying to figure out is, how do we look at how people are organizing today and incorporate these models into our systems of governance, right? When we look at our organizing models today, they're very flat, and we can use words like spider webs, snowflakes, any other mechanism. You probably have a better name for how we these multinodal systems that are non-hierarchical but connect people. There's systems, and I'll let you speak to it if you choose to. But in order to talk about how our governance system works, they're strictly hierarchical. And we have not done a great job of trying to figure out how to incorporate how people actually engage and connect in their daily lives and moving these systems into our governance practices, not just as reference points or recommendations or communities from C3 deliberative democracy exercises, but meaningful parts of our governance. And I think you speak to some of these ideas in the book, and it is actually an area where we're actually moving into some of the funding work, because we realize in our 21st century democracy, if we're not really talking about changing what the governance systems look like, these external models that touch but don't actually move, can't get us where we need to go. And the expectation of what people expect from their democracy, how they engage in their democracy, because if people don't believe in the democracy, the outcomes are going to be very different. What does it mean to have a crisis of legitimacy in our government and governance systems? And we've been able to kind of dodge, I think, that bullet for a really long time, but I think there are some real questions we can talk about. But what does it mean today if people don't believe that government can provide the solutions and they're not actually engaged in the process in any way? So these are some of the things your comments triggered, but I'm sure I'm missing things, but I've gone on too long. Thank you.
So just to jump in on both of those, I'm scribbling a lot of thoughts myself as you guys are both talking. It's such a pleasure. It's always such a pleasure to hear both of you think out loud. It's one of the things I love about doing these kinds of things with you both. So if we think about what is it, how do we get concrete, right, about recreating or creating anew a sense of democracy and a sense of power? And I think it's kind of in both of these last rounds of comments. So maybe say three things about this. So the first thing, which both of you touched on, is that what is the thing that we're trying to change? I think we have to be clearer that the things we're trying to change aren't the immediately surface visible things, but really it's the deep structure. So Keisha, when you were talking about sort of the deep, the wiring of our democracy, right? How many poll sites are there? How do you add voter ID laws? All of these restrictions, it's not just about showing up to vote. There's a whole infrastructure to our democracy that got rigged up, right? And the same is true for our economy, right? It's not just about taxes and growth and whatever. There's a whole infrastructure to corporate governance and the role of finance and the structure of work and the physical structure of our cities that concentrate poverty and cut communities off from opportunity. These are like sort of the deep wiring of our society. And one of the things that progressives have to do is we need to, this first point on is we need to sort of identify the target, right? So that's when we say we want structural change. To me, what that means is getting into the wiring of these different systems and starting to rework them so that they produce a more equitable and inclusive society. The second point is if that's the goal, then how do we do that? It's really hard, right? Infrastructure is hidden. That's the nature of infrastructure. And so I talk in the book a lot about John Dewey, who is a philosopher who I love, but who is horrible to quote. He is not quotable at all. But one of the things that he says is that the problem of the public in the modern world is that it feels inchoate. And that caught in the sweep of things we cannot change and cannot act on. And to me, that's a really powerful way of understanding the problem. Structures are so diffuse and hidden. How do we even change this stuff, right? And so to me, the answer to that is that's what government and organizing is about. It's about giving us the power as collectives that we don't have as individuals to change those structures. And so then the last point, number 3, which is how do we bake that into the fabric of our day-to-day lives? It can't be about something, pulling a lever every 4 years. That's not democracy. It has to be something that enables us, empowers us, ennobles us, right, in a daily way of having a say in what our structures ought to look like. And that can be like very small bore in a lot of ways, right? It's a zoning decision, or the location of the polling place, or any one of a number of things that can feel very micro, but done systematically, that's democracy.
So then, maybe we can spend a few more minutes. Get applause every time.
I know,
you speak.
right?
It's great.
I'm just gonna stay here. Yeah.
So-
You don't get those in class, do you?
No, I do not get applause lines in class. This is definitely true.
So, Oprah.
Oh, God.
I want to move to kind of next steps and like the way forward. I would like to spend a couple minutes on diagnosis. And both of you have sort of talked about organizing and the importance of it. I work for an organization that is engaged in community organizing. But I also think this is a moment in which we have to engage in some self-reflection on our own work and our own practice. And I wonder if you have thoughts about why we came up short. What are the ways in which we may need to retool? And I don't mean why Hillary Clinton came up short and didn't win 270 electoral votes. But I mean us as a movement or an intersection of various movements, not having the collective power to prevent a xenophobic, racist, misogynistic, and many other things demagogue from winning the White House. So I wanted to open the floor for that. What can we learn about our own practice from this result, from this moment?
Sabio?
I feel like I just gave a little rip, so I don't want to.
Well, okay.
For Keisha.
So I was writing down my thoughts this morning, very early in the morning after staying up very, very late. And not necessarily for this, but just like there's all these things going through your brain. And I found myself sort of unable to articulate the feeling that I had. And so right now I've settled on the great wrongness, right? There's just something that feels just wrong about where we are. We can point to different pieces of things, but I think, again, like in the book, the idea of all these pieces of intersectionality are really some of our biggest challenges, and I think that's also happening on the sort of movement side, that it is not clear as we move through different spaces and pieces of the movement or various movements, that there's a clear understanding of the intersections of the ideas and concepts that they're trying to undermine. Right, so there's definitely a systemic attack and a systemic approach to looking at economic inequality, and there's a systemic approach to looking at racial injustice, and there are systemic approaches to looking at our democratic systems. But one of the things that I find in looking at, how do we fund this work, how do we think about this work, one of the biggest challenges that we find is these organizations are not necessarily in communication with each other in a way that is always, I think internally, individually, we're seeing more and more recognition of the intersectionality, the issues that they're trying to approach and attack. So there's no question that institutionally and individually, we're seeing a massive growth and going from embryonic to very mature movements, and I think very quick speed. But there's the same isms and challenges that gave rise to the separate movements are also challenging to bring people together in some ways. And I think that's one of the challenges that we're having. How do you get this movement work to truly connect meaningfully with each other, and being able to take the recognition about the intersectionality that we're seeing each space occupying, I think in a more effective way. And I think that is one of the things that we have to speak to, and that is separate and apart from the idea of improving our democracy. And you want to talk about, that's where we really aren't seeing connections, where you start to see the sort of intellectual approach or the good government approaches or the organizations that say, look, we're working very hard to improve these systems, and they're unable to relate their goals to improving economic performance, to reducing economic inequality, to looking specifically at racial justice and how these things tie together, and really want to root their value just in the idea of engagement without tying it to benefit of those who are engaging. Like those kinds of systemic questions, I think we really see some meaningful chasms. I think on the other side, I think the movement groups are growing and getting to that place. Whether or not that was achieved in this particular election cycle, I don't know. But I think that we do have some really big chasms, not schisms, that would suggest we were together and broke apart. I'm not even sure it's gotten to that point yet. But certainly I think there are some definite challenges, particularly around movement groups and structural reform.
This good governance point, I think, is a really important one, and I'm glad you raised that. There is a strand of sort of liberal policymaking or wonkery, right, that I think a lot of us maybe are a little too easy to collapse into a little too easily. So in the book I call it managerialism, but I think it's what you're calling
Right, the
good governance.
technocratic
Yeah.
solutions to how we fix our democracy.
Totally.
No relationship with how people live.
Totally, right, and that's true on the democracy side, and it's true on really any substantive policy side. So if you think about it, like, one of the big fault lines, say, before Obama, or before the racial reaction, the white lash to Obama really became clear. Before then, we tended to think of our politics framed around a clash between, government types and free market types, right? And in that framing, one of the big moves that liberals made, especially after the 80s, was to defuse the free market sort of anti-government attacks by sort of doubling down on this technocratic good governance idea that the way we're going to do policy is trust smart people who will operate on the basis of neutral scientific expertise, and then everybody agrees, right? We all agree that growth is good, and we all agree that Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen should be deciding monetary policy and not random people in a focus group, right? And that's this idea of expertise as a safe harbor is like really attractive, but I feel like this is one of the things that I think we do wrong as progressives, right? We're too enamored of this idea, and it pulls us away from exactly the kind of deep democratic, community-based decisions and goals and aspirations that I think you were just talking about.
So there's a lot there. I would say in terms of diagnosis to your question, we got everything wrong, right? There's no question about that. And there's going to be lots of noise, just an incredible amount of noise of opinions on this. And so I think it's helpful for all of us to, in the next few days and weeks, to have some humility. And because everyone's going to have their pet theory, right? Of, this explains what happened. And I think a dimension that's important for us to all remember is something Sabeel said. And so I'd encourage us all to think about what are the surface level explanations versus the deep structural ones. Because I think there are lots we could fill up in both those boxes. So with humility, I'll offer some on the surface side, right? And I'm thinking about this both as someone who sometimes plays a pundit on TV, who we all got it wrong, clearly there, but also as a card-carrying political scientist. And scholars of American politics are not going to have to throw out an entire generation of scholarship because we all got it wrong there too, right? So every theory that we might have had, the ground game in organization matters more. Bullshit. Clearly that's not true. Negative campaigns depress turnout. That's wrong now after 30 years of that. Objective economic conditions predict who's going to win the White House. So, the economy looked good on paper or as experts talk about it. But I think we now know objective economic conditions don't really predict. They didn't predict this one. People are rational voters. No, people are emotional voters. Can we just be done with the rational voter theorem, right, for once? People are emotional voters, and people don't interpret objective conditions, or they do in a different way, right? So even if the economic indicators look good in terms of unemployment rate or economic growth, how people perceive their own economic situation is very different than any objective condition over here. So if I'm interpreting my station as in decline or my children are going to be worse off, then I'm going to be emotionally angry about that and will vote accordingly. So anyway, those are just some examples. Another one, the Obama coalition has swept in a realignment of our politics with, this new combination of demographics of people of color and women and millennials. Hey, majority of white millennials voted for Trump. Majority of white millennials voted for Romney last time too, so I'm not putting my money on millennials saving us. So anyway, all of this, right, these are all the surface level things we're going to be hearing over the next few weeks. And I think it's helped. What Seville actually offers us is a way to think about the deeper structures. How are people feeling not free? How are people feeling systems of power are dominating them? How are they interpreting that? And then how do those deeper structures influence people's surface level behavior up here? I think that should be part of our diagnosis in addition to the surface level noise we're going to be hearing. That's depressing, don't clap for that.
So I know we want to open it up soon.
But can I have one more thing? The other thing we do need to theorize and push back against, this is important, is the normalization of explicit racism and misogyny.
Thank you.
I wrote that down. That is actually that's probably what scares me the most in this moment, is the normalization of what we've seen in the last 18 months.
Yeah, I think that's super important. Absolutely. I'll add a couple of other maybe more mundane things sort of on the list of things to focus on. So what are some of those deep structures, right? Just to make it real concrete. They may not seem like on the surface they connect directly to those surface level points as Dorian was talking about, but I think they are connected. So first is finance and the financialization of the economy. We thought we solved the problem in 2008. One of the things I talk about in the book is we totally didn't, and I'm kind of terrified that that part of the book seemed to be borne out. It's a big part of why the economy feels rigged, because it is.
Yep.
The second related one is monopoly power. The antitrust movement was a big part of the progressive movement 100 years ago, and lo and behold, here we are 30 odd years after the Reagan Revolution, and monopolies are back in a big way, and that's also part of what's rigging the economy. Third thing is the changing nature of work. Both Keisha and Dorian know much more about this than I do, but the idea of work as opportunity, as upward mobility, as dignity is just not true in today's economy for most people. And that has to do with the wiring and structuring issue. And then the last thing I'll mention, just because it's near and dear to my heart as a cities guy, right? We were talking about federalism, is the wiring of our cities. Our cities are wired to reproduce and exacerbate inequality. And that's a problem. They've been this way really actually since the New Deal. This is not a conservative thing. This is one of the big failures of 20th century progressivism, is the sort of the racial segregation baked into our cities, which we still have to undo. So that's really concrete. The last thing I just want to add is to go back abstract, because I am a card-carrying political theorist, so I get to do this sort of thing. Dorian has a Du Bois quote. I have two quotes which I want to leave you with before we open up. But these are really the bookends of the book. It's the first thing in the book and the last thing in the book. So first thing in the book is this quote from Walt Whitman. From his piece Democratic Vistas, and he says, I think it's apt for our discussion today, we have frequently printed the word democracy, yet it is a word the real gist of which still sleeps, quite unawakened, notwithstanding the resonance and the many angry tempests out of which its syllables have come from pen or tongue. It is a great word whose history remains unwritten, because that history is yet to be enacted. Then, about 30 odd years later, Louis Brandeis, speaking to the Finance Cooperative in Boston, and he had this to say: 100 years ago, the civilized world did not believe that it was possible that the people could rule themselves. They did not believe that it was possible to have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. America in the last century proved democracy is a success. The civilized world today believes that in the industrial world, self-government is impossible, that we must adhere to the system we have known as a monarchical system, the system of master and servant, or as more politely called, employer and employee. It rests with this century, and perhaps with America, to prove that as we have in the political world shown what self-government can do, we are to pursue the same lines in the industrial world. So Brandeis's charge, I think in a lot of ways, produced, or eventually yielded the New Deal.
Yep.
And I think what we're hearing today, in our discussion and what we are faced with in a Trump era, is that our charge is to realize this idea of democracy as economic, political, and social inclusion, which we have never had in this country.
Yeah.
It's a tall order, but we have no choice but to make that our project. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. So we're going to open the floor for questions. Let's take 3 to start. We can just take a few and pass them around the panel. I would encourage 2 things about questions. Many of you have been at this type of event before. I think everybody always appreciates if people try and keep their questions short and concise and make sure that they end with a question mark. I'm going to try and be fairly disciplined, and if they seem like they're going on and there is no question mark in sight, I may try and rein it in. We have roaming mics in the back. I see a hand here, a hand at the back, and then a hand there. So why don't we start there?
Good evening. I'm Peter Derby. I've been a part of New America Foundation for almost 20 years. And I must say, I'm used to seeing ideas discussed from both angles. So I will see a progressive idea and also see a conservative idea about inclusion. And tonight I don't see that, and I'm surprised about that. Secondly, when you speak about all, not all of us are mourning. Some of us are disappointed, maybe surprised, but we're not mourning. And in ways, I'm hearing racism and exclusion. You're talking about inclusion, but I'm hearing exclusion in the way you're presenting it. So you're excluding, so are you upset that all the white men voted and therefore it's not right? There's certain ways here I just find that's just not the New America Foundation that I knew for 20 years.
Okay.
Okay, so a couple of things. So why isn't there that second prism? And why aren't we focusing on inclusion and through those 2 prisms? Because I believe that the conservatives have a view on inclusion and you have a progressive view on inclusion.
Okay. Thank you for those questions. We had here and then here.
Hi, so thank you for all the comments so far. My question is from a rather different perspective. So for me, and this may be coming from a somewhat hysterical feeling of mourning, which I do have today, is my fear when I hear the conversation about democracy and democratic inclusion is that we have a candidate who was elected on a rhetoric of complete disrespect for the institutions that kind of are the foundation of this country. And so I guess my fear, and I'm curious as to your perspective on it, is what does that mean? Is that just rhetoric, or what are your thoughts about the potential for the institutions of democracy to really kind of have a place in this Trump era, and what can we do about it?
The third hand was over there.
Hi, very brief question, but it could be a complicated answer. If the election had gone the other way, if Hillary Clinton had been elected last night, what would be the nature of this conversation we're having tonight? Because ostensibly, everyone knew they were going to be attending this on November 9th. So what were the thoughts going through your head as to what the conversation would be like had Hillary won? How much of it would still, what percentage of tonight would still be talking about Trump and that whole aspect of it?
Okay, thank you for those questions. So first of all, just to one point of your question, I think I can only speak from an I statement. I know a lot of the folks I've been surrounded by today and in my community have been in mourning, and it has been my sense to a great degree in New York and among New Yorkers. But I think you're right insofar as I don't purport to speak for anyone, and I don't think I think all of us come with the intention of speaking with I statements. With that being said, I think there was a question, first of all, about is there a conservative idea of inclusion that has not come up, that we're not being cognizant of in our responses? There were also, these other 2 questions, we kind of had the idea of, what is the potential of our institutions? How robust are they? And then maybe we can get to the counterfactual, which is an interesting question as well.
Yeah, I'll maybe kick off with a couple of quick thoughts. And actually, the questions are very much related to one another, I think. Kind of going in a different order. So before knowing the outcome of the election, right? One of the things that maybe was not emphasized quite as much, but and I certainly talk a lot about it in the book, and I've written about this elsewhere, is that I at least am pretty critical of some of the conventional tropes, shall we say, of what kind of conventional progressivism or liberalism or sort of many of the traditions that Hillary Clinton works in as being really problematic. And I think we sort of touched on this when we were talking about expertise and technocracy, but to put a finer point on it, I think one of the real problems of Hillary Clinton is she sort of works in a particular liberal tradition that emphasizes, that cuts right to the answer of government solving a problem, dissociated from a community, or dissociated from the idea of democracy. And so that to your question, sir, I actually have a lot of resonance, I think, or feel a lot of resonance with many small c conservative, I'll say, critiques about government, value of community, importance of decentralization, and small d democracy. I think there is a lot of intellectual connection there that can be built and drawn out more. But that said, and as this is a woman's question in the middle, I think there are some lines that I would draw. And I think one of the lines is that a democracy that has all the kinds of structural flaws that I think each of us talked about, and that is not actually a government of the people, by the people, for the people, as in the full sense, full membership of the people. That's not the kind of democracy I think we have in mind. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thoughts?
I think those two questions are related, or the three actually are related in a sense. What's interesting about the first question, the inclusion, who's included and who's not, and this is also related to what if Clinton had won? I would have been talking about the internal contradictions and implosion of the Republican Party. And I still think that Trump is not representative, I think, of modern conservatism or the GOP in a couple of ways, right? Just read Bill Kristol's Twitter feed if you want an indication of this. Or go to many of the conservative elites who are anti-Trump, right? Because on many grounds, his position on trade, of which Democrats and Republicans tended to agree the last 30 years in terms of the benefits of globalization and free trade. Both parties were out of touch. Most of the candidates on the Republican side were out of touch with how people actually felt about it. And on the other side, that's why you got a Bernie Sanders, right? That was the populist overlap of Trump and Sanders supporters that conservative and liberal elites didn't quite capture. And we're surprised by. I think it also, again, to put us in a broader context, I think most of us, left and right, didn't understand, for instance, the support for Brexit or what's happening in other Western democracies, right? Those of us that talk at New America and Roosevelt and other think tanks, we are pretty out of touch too, right? With what people are thinking and feeling in particular, I'll emphasis on feeling. So I think there are these internal contradictions within the Republican Party that right now, in this moment, people aren't going to be paying attention to because of, I think, the victory of Trump. But I think they're not going away and they're not resolved. And in fact, in 4 years and 8 years, they will come back because running on explicit racist appeals, that's not a long-term winning strategy. And in fact, it might have worked this time, but the numbers are not on the conservative movement side in terms of demographic change. And so there will have to be a strategy. And one can make an argument for the sake of democracy. I want a competitive two-party system. So thinking long-term, this is not a winning strategy for the conservative movement if you believe in conservative values. And then the last thing I think on this, I was gonna actually kind of attack Clinton pretty harshly, if you wanted to know. But not from a conservative place, right? From a different place. because, there was a pretty stark debate on the left about Clintons, and I think for some people, I am in mourning, I will say it, but I'm kind of happy to close the door on the Clintons in some ways, and think through what does a more robust set of candidates who are more visionary look like going forward. I think we have to grapple with that question, but that was my plan. I was actually planning to come and attack Hillary Clinton and that part of the Democratic Party from the 80s and 90s, especially through today. That was my plan. One last thing. I'm a big fan of Corey Robin. He's a professor at Brooklyn College and writes about the history of conservative ideas. It's interesting. He has this book called The Reactionary Mind, I believe. And so the interesting thing about conservatism, I think, to think about in this moment, is that conservatism is always a reaction to something. By default, it is reacting against some kind of change. And so you see this in the rhetoric, right, of people, make America great again. Take my country back. Back to what? It's not a future-oriented ideology or philosophy. And that's 200 years, it's not a new thing. It's not a surface-level thing. So I actually think in this moment of Trump victory, conservatism will lose its raison d'etre soon, because ultimately Trump's not going to be able to deliver on what he's promised. So in 4 years, let's ask that question that Ronald Reagan made famous, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Because inherent in his promises, his populist promises, he is not capable, but more importantly, his philosophy is not capable of delivering.
Hold on to your humility.
Go ahead, Keisha.
I think it's, so I'm going to start, I think, in reverse order as we think about what would we have been talking about had Hillary Clinton won. I think we would have been talking about, at least from my perspective, the complete and total meaningful abandonment of communities of color by the Democratic Party. That in fact, the Democratic Party has not served, is not responsive to, and this whole idea that there is a partisan savior for communities when we don't even have a clear sense with our democratic structures what community is anymore. We define communities by our geographic structure, right? That's how we define political action. I know I can move this because I have a district, and I know I'm aligned with the people in that district, and we move something forward. But I would hazard a guess, if we were to sit down and ask Dorian, list all the communities you think you belong to, and there'd be like a list of 15 or something. Then we said, what are the most important 5? And get down to those. And we said, of those 5 communities, what would inspire you to take political action based on someone else's relationship of merely being in that community with you? Somebody simply asking you to do something to move you to action. And how many of those people in those communities are geographically based? How do we think about our individuals as political actors and the political systems and structures by which we have designed people to act? And so we've got all these political ideas, right? We've got campaign finance reform, which, I mean, was designed, what, in the 70s? Are you guys alive? We've got our campaign finance reform, we have our redistricting reform. I'm not saying old is bad, but I am suggesting that these reforms were designed in a time where our policies, our electorate, our campaigns, everything we did was different, yet we still adhere to these ideas in these ways, and we do this exercise of going and understanding what people think and how people feel, and then we take that information and we figure, how do we sell these reforms to you, as opposed to saying, how do people understand who they are as political actors and design the reforms to respond to how people actually consider themselves to be political actors in this space. And we have done a really lousy job of really trying to figure out who people are, how people are, and how we're engaging in this 21st century democracy has got to catch up. And I think that some of the old school models that disserve the Clinton campaign, this old school thing where you can just count on people turning out in a certain kind of way, that you can just count on things happening, and really, so you've got a candidate that's not going to the middle, so we're gonna drive to the middle, leave our base out in the cold. All these were terribly bad decisions. And even if she had won, which was, 200,000 votes, or, I mean, there wasn't a lot of distance here. These complaints would have been equally valid, and I think you would have heard some of that conversation. I think, however, because of who won, and the overt racism and misogyny and other aspects of his campaign that are now resonating, the threat to individuals and people in our culture, in our society, there are definite responses to that. And so I think that's kind of where the noise is coming from for me. And so I think I touched a little bit on our institutions. I think specifically the candidate's disrespect for institutions flows from a lack of understanding of those same institutions. And whether or not he'll be able to produce, I think, is going to be a real difficulty to really feel, because the promises really reflect a lack of understanding about what those institutions are, more so than I think disrespect. It's just a lack of understanding, and what can come out of that is going to be extremely limited.
Okay. I'm realizing we wanted to be able to take more questions. We're actually time constrained in this space. So the way that I would like to close is maybe we can just go down the line. 30 seconds each. Is there an idea that you can share that's in your mind about the way forward? You can be as hopeful or not hopeful as you'd like to be. But something that you think coming out of this and coming out of November 9th moving forward, we need to take with us, regardless of how we're feeling today, in the work that we're doing, whether it is related to governance or organizing. Jordan, do you want to start?
Yeah, no, I think the question I have in my mind, and I think people on the left should be asking, is what does a multiracial democracy that's fully inclusive look like? And actually, what would people on the left say to white working class and middle class Trump supporters? What is their alternative vision, in addition to a vision for people of color, for immigrants, right, for a fully inclusive society? What does a true multiracial democracy look like? And what is the vision around freedom and justice attached to that look like?
Keisha?
I think as we think about what's next, I think we're going to have to think a great deal. Again, I'm so systems focused, and I can't help it. I can't break myself of that habit. But really thinking about how our systems are serving our democracy. What does democracy look like? And not just the idea of saying, well, what does it look like? But how do we actually place that into action? And not just have sort of ideas and intentions, but meaningfully think about how do we conceive of the outcomes that are designed around that, and what are then the systems and structures that must accompany the ideas of democracy to bring a meaningful outcome for people to engage.
That's great. Both of those are great. Just maybe piggybacking off each. Two quick kind of slogans even, or I hate the word slogans, but first is name villains and solve problems. And the second is democracy is us. So what do I mean by that? Name villains, solve problems. I think we have to start from a place where we agree on who the villains are of our current economy. And at least for me, if we can't agree on that, then we can't actually go about solving the problem. But I think we should be open about what the solutions to those problems are. So too big to fail is a villain. It's a problem for our economy and for democracy. We should be able to agree on that. Now let's have a conversation about how to solve the problem, and I'm pretty open to what that looks like. And the last thing, democracy is us. Democracy is us, right? We're here in this room. None of this happens unless we all do everything we can. And that has to be more than just voting. It means a lot more than that.
Right.
I think all of us agree on that's kind of one of the subtexts, right? Democracy is us. And if it's not us, it's somebody else. And then you get problems, right? So, thank you.
That is a pretty apt way to end the evening. We do want to continue the conversation. The panelists are going to stick around.